The great rivalry between Britain and Germany, which truly took off during the 20th century, is one of the most consequential in all of human history. After having lost the colonies which went on to become the United States, and toppling Napoleon on the European mainland, Britain retained its dominance over the seas, and in the course of a century proceeded to expand and develop its colonial domain until the largest empire the world had ever known. The British held a major presence on nearly every continent, even establishing settler colonies, essentially extensions of itself, in North America via Canada, in Oceania via Australia and New Zealand, and in Africa via the Cape Colony. Britain absolutely dominated global trade and grew exceptionally wealthy and powerful from this, entering into a period of splendid isolation, in which they needed to rely on no one but themselves. Understandably, this left a sour taste in the mouths of other great powers who longed to surpass or at the very least stand as equals to Britain. This included the likes of Russia, who competed with Britain for dominance over Eurasia during what became known as the Great Game, and of course Britain's age-old rival of France. The French truly hit a peak under Napoleon and his French Empire. The country was never the same since, and struggled to reassert its place as the leading continental power and as a viable force abroad. France suffered from internal instability, conflicts of identity, division over leadership, and a general lack of vision for the future. That appears to have been stopped briefly under the leadership of Napoleon III, who laid out a clear new vision for the country and a path for the French to regain their prominence and prestige. But unbeknownst to the new Napoleon, another power on the continent had determined that France's time as the heart of Europe had come to an end, and it was now time for a new line to lead the pride. In Central Europe stood the Germanic states, Austria, Prussia, and the lesser states of the Confederation. The Austrians had long held domination over Germania, with the Habsburg royal line having controlled the Confederation and its predecessor, the Holy Roman Empire, for centuries by that point. But Austria was waning. Much like France, it was weakened by the aftereffects of the Napoleonic Wars, and struggled to keep its empire together. The Austrians found themselves divided and uncertain for their own future. Austria was a Germanic state, and it held deeply vested interest in Germanic Europe. However, its time in the Holy Roman Empire had also left it with consequential ties to the Mediterranean, ties which now became liabilities as the Italian state of Sardinia sought to reunite the whole of Italy by seizing back lands held by Austria. Additionally, the Austrians were a Balkan power, having withstood incursions by the Islamic Ottomans centuries prior, and now liberating the Christian populations of the region. But Russia too sought to break Ottoman hold over the Balkans, but intended to fully bring this region with a dominantly Slavic and Orthodox population under its own control, something Austria wasn't willing to allow. Simply put, Austria was divided, both by external and internal factors. They were a multi-ethnic state attempting to fight three rivals on three fronts for dominance in three different arenas. The second great power of Germania, Prussia, recognized this and increasingly moved to drive Austria out of German politics while bringing the lesser states closer under its control. Prussia and Austria would ultimately go to war, during which time the Sardinians allied with Prussia and seized additional Italian lands from Austria, while Prussia fully excluded Austria from the Germanic sphere, leaving it an exclusively Balkan power which was further forced to share primacy with the Hungarian half of the empire, while its Slavic population began to demand the same. Prussia, with Germania now under its sway, saw the opportunity to consolidate its realm against the common enemy, that being France, and assert its own position as the leader of continental Europe. Now before we go any further, let's take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Babbel. No doubt you've already heard of Babbel, as they're one of the leading language programs out there. Babbel makes use of interactive and quick 10-minute lessons that have been scientifically proven to get users speaking a new language within 3 weeks. Babbel is so confident in their program that your purchase is backed by a 20-day money-back guarantee. I studied French growing up, and apparently I happen to speak it pretty well, but the truth was I didn't have too many opportunities to use my French speaking skills, and they sort of grew stiff with time. So that's something I've been meaning to brush up on and maybe use as an excuse to visit some of the francophone countries, just for the sake of not letting this skill go without use. Français est bon de savoir quand l'Empire français reprend inévitablement l'Europe. I'm also going to aim to learn proper Italian. My grandparents used to speak to me in Italian when I was growing up, and it was at the point where I could understand them, but I couldn't put the words together myself, so I'd speak in English while they spoke in Italian, and I just never properly learned to actually speak it, so we'll be giving that a shot just for the heck of it. Now you can try this excellent program yourself at a whopping 65% discount when you follow the link in the description below. It's summer, have a little fun, do a little traveling, and maybe a little trolling. Now, back to the video. Prussia would repeatedly provoke France until finally the Franco-Prussian War broke out. Napoleon III was overconfident in France's abilities, while Prussia's own Otto von Bismarck knew well that France was weak and no match for the better organized Prussian army. The war was over in half a year, and in an embarrassing outcome, Napoleon III was captured in battle. The Prussians united the German realm into the German Empire and replaced France as the continental leader. But by the late 1800s, that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to be a powerful state within Europe alone. The true mark of power in that age was the possession of a colonial empire, an empire from which a great bounty of resources could be extracted to fuel a truly world-class economy. Spain had remnants of a colonial empire. The French were re-establishing a colonial empire. Even the Dutch had a colonial empire. If Germany was to be the new axis around which Europe spun, it would need more resources, and now with its own domestic realm having been secured, it had the means with which to make new claims. Germany would establish colonial holds within Africa and play a guiding role in the partitioning of the continent. Germany came away with relatively few but strategically valuable territories, which they ultimately intended to bring together in the form of a grand Middle Africa colony, through gradual purchases and conquests. In the meantime, attention turned to the Asian Pacific, where the Germans felt that they still had a strong opportunity for colonization, but much like Africa, Britain expedited its own land grabs to deny them to the Germans, sensing that the Germans sought to compete with Britain as a global economic and military power. Seeing now that Britain not only dominated the globe but sought to prevent any other rival from coming close to sharing in that power, Germany grew increasingly hostile toward the British, going against Bismarck's intention of concentrating on France. The French, though defeated once, were still a threat to Germany if they were to align with another great power. Bismarck promoted a policy of isolating France and gradually weakening them year by year, but Kaiser Wilhelm II felt confident in Germany's position over France and turned to the next biggest target, unintentionally bringing the once bitter rivals of France and Britain closer together through a common enemy. This would lead to the Entente Cordiale, which strengthened Franco-British relations and led to the establishment of an alliance between the two, which ultimately saw Britain side with France during the Great War, merely utilizing Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium as an official pretext for its involvement. But things almost went in a very different direction. There was a period in which some within Britain saw Germany as not an emerging rival, but as a new ally to cooperate with against their mutual adversaries, a useful force on the continent to maintain order and keep both France and Russia in check. Germany itself was cautious of these two powers on its western and eastern borders, as relations between France and Russia had spawned an alliance seemingly aimed at placing Germany in a vulnerable position, and thus negotiations were held between Germany and Britain for the establishment of their own alliance. However, these negotiations fell through. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, this alliance succeeded? The architect of this potential Anglo-German alliance was none other than the Right Honourable Secretary of State to the Colonies, Joseph Chamberlain, father of Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain by this point in his career had become one of the leading figures in the pursuit of reformed imperialism. See, while Britain appeared a powerful empire externally, internally the British were losing their grasp over their settler colonies, which, as they developed, sought increased independence from the motherland. Chamberlain saw this and knew that a new solution was necessary, and until that solution fully manifested, the British could not afford to sour ties with the most powerful state in their immediate neighborhood. France was manageable, Russia was manageable, Germany was difficult. Alone, there was little that Britain could do to counter the mighty land power in the heart of Europe. Doing so would mean investing its trust in another power like France, but with the French having been so utterly humiliated by the Germans not so long ago, and with the uncertain level of stability with Napoleon III now gone, could the French truly be relied upon? Could the French even be trusted to not betray the British out of spite for their centuries-long rivalry? Simply, no. Britain had to parley with Germany directly if a lasting solution was to be found. In 1898, Chamberlain did meet with Germany's ambassador to discuss what he called their mutual interests and reassured him that the tensions experienced between their two countries were not indicative of irreconcilable differences. Together they might dominate China and carve out exclusive spheres of influence for themselves at the expense of Russia and France. However, the ambassador's hands were tied as political opinions back home stood against Britain and looked upon the offer with suspicion. An offer was made for Britain to concede colonial land to Germany as a sign of goodwill before receiving any commitment from the Germans, but understandably Britain rejected the offer. The following year, Chamberlain met with Kaiser Wilhelm, but he too expressed distrust in Britain as an ally. It was proposed by Chamberlain that Britain, the US, and Germany establish an alliance in response to that of France and Russia, one which would see Anglo-American domination of the Atlantic and Pacific, as well as German domination of the European continent. But Germany simply didn't see it as practical, or rather, Kaiser Wilhelm claims to have not seen it as practical. Still, Chamberlain was encouraged by Germany's foreign minister and later chancellor to begin warming the public up to the idea of an Anglo-Teutonic alliance, but upon his doing so, the Germans would proceed to mock Britain during a meeting of the Reichstag, making Chamberlain appear foolish to the British public, to whom he had just spoken so highly of Germany. In 1901, Chamberlain would attempt one last time to forge an alliance with Germany, and Kaiser Wilhelm insisted to his officials that the offer be accepted. However, they opted to remain on the fence until Britain appeared more desperate, hoping to negotiate from a higher position of power and force Britain to offer a promise of security to Austria as a term of the alliance. The result was that the negotiations once again fell through, and finally Chamberlain was fed up with Germany's sense of superiority. The Anglo-German alliance was abandoned and an Anglo-French alliance emerged, but this time, things are different. Now, immediately we might suppose that if Britain were more willing to concede land to Germany, then the alliance might have fully manifested. Such a thing might have occurred had Franco-British relations severely deteriorated in the lead-up to the first meeting with Germany, specifically during the 1898 Sudan crisis. perhaps making a territorial concession appear more reasonable in offer in exchange for an alliance, except that wouldn't even be a guarantee, nor would it resolve the bigger problem that halted this alliance from manifesting. Germany was not in any position to be making the demands it had been without offering something of substance in return. It certainly may have been the dominant power in continental Europe, but Britain was still stronger. Britain may have been facing internal struggles, but it was still capable of checking its rivals by other means. The antagonistic and overly superior approach Germany took to these negotiations cost them a valuable ally, but seemed strangely out of place on its own. So why precisely did Germany behave in such a reckless manner? As it turns out, what sabotaged the negotiations was ultimately a terrible degree of miscommunication that began with the abnormal directness of Chamberlain. Unlike most politicians of the day, he was very matter-of-fact with what he said and did not attempt to mask his full intentions, as he thought that this more often than not overcomplicated negotiations and left both parties with unwanted and unexpected baggage. Germany, given past grievances with Britain and the traditionally deceptive and tactical nature of such negotiations, felt as though Chamberlain's offer was too good to be true and assumed Britain had some ulterior motive, most likely that in the wake of the crisis in Sudan, Britain was secretly on the brink of war with Russia or France and sought to dupe Germany and Austria into fighting a continental war on two fronts. To Germany, this wasn't a what you see is what you get kind of deal. Britain would have only done such a thing if it was in a vulnerable position, desperate for support, and attempting to exploit Germany in some way. Of course, that wasn't the case, and German paranoia, along with miscommunication over exactly what the alliance entailed, bungled the arrangement 3 times over, as the offer was either rejected outright or given under conditions that seemed unreasonable, when in fact both sides had nothing to lose and everything to gain. The Germans feared that allying with Britain would antagonize Russia and fully lose them a potential ally. However, the Russians and French were already under the impression that an Anglo-German alliance was inevitable, and used this fear to facilitate their own alliance, which, by the time of Germany and Britain's first negotiation, was already established. On the other hand, Britain feared that Germany's belligerence made them a high-cost ally, and that German support in defense of the British Isles was nowhere near worth such an arrangement, especially when Britain was quite capable of defending its homeland on its own. What Britain really needed was assistance in maintaining its overseas colonies, which it felt Germany had its eyes on. In reality, Britain proved to be a capable counter to both French and Russian action, having kept France in its place for centuries by that point, and having fended off major Russian gains during the recent Great Game. Germany in turn did not feel the need to replace Britain, but matched them sufficiently enough that the German Empire needed not depend upon Britain's global economic empire. Germany wanted self-sufficiency and its own little sphere of influence that reflected its place of importance. German and British interests only clashed in a handful of lands of minor importance, and stood to gain more by turning their focus against Russia and France. For the sake of this scenario, we are going to suppose that during these negotiations, Chamberlain is able to better convey Britain's desires without stoking paranoia among the Germans, and both sides are able to clearly express their global geopolitical goals and how they can help one another achieve them. The Germans want a check against France and Russia, but not merely for Germany, but the recently unstable ally of Austria as well, and to a lesser extent Italy, who was also a member of the Triple Alliance. This is what was actually proposed by the Germans during the third round of negotiations, but Britain turned it down, and understandably so. Britain had no interest in involving itself in a war on behalf of what it considered to be a great power in decline and a state which hardly constituted a great power at all, just for the promise of German support if war broke out between Britain and its rivals. Once again, Britain didn't face any major threats on its home front, and it was assumed that this was all Germany was offering. However, this is where miscommunication really compromised the alliance. What the Germans were actually proposing was something far more substantial than protection for Britain alone. What Germany envisioned was an arrangement which treated the entirety of the British Empire as a single unit, meaning that a Russian or French incursion upon any of Britain's colonies would have brought the same weight of German retaliation as a direct attack upon Britain. This wasn't just limited to France and Russia, but as per the Triple Alliance, safeguarded against any great power, including Japan, the United States, and the Ottoman Empire. What Germany would have provided in exchange for imperial protection for itself and its allies was constant security for Britain's colonial empire. That absolutely changes things and would have made this offer much more appealing to Britain, who under Chamberlain only envisioned a separate multilateral alliance between Germany, Britain, and the US, and a new Triple Alliance separate from that which Germany already held with Austria and Italy. In this alternate timeline, both sides make clear the full scope of their alliance proposals, as well as their long-term geopolitical plans for the world. Formal arrangements are made for Britain to join the Central Powers, and the alliance officially comes into effect in the year 1900. This new Anglo-German alliance would herald a new era in the global order, as France and Russia's greatest fears would be realized, and their check against Germany had now been checked. They stood no chance of threatening the Triple, or rather now Quadruple Alliance. Austria would be able to stand secure against Balkan threats, rising Serbian and Yugoslav nationalism in particular, without fear of Russian retaliation. Germany would be free to expand its colonial holdings at the expense of France without needing to worry about being overwhelmed on the continent. And Britain, with its rivals in check, would continue to focus on reforming and strengthening bonds with its settler colonies instead of forcing itself to compete with the other great powers to maintain a power balance. Immediately, this undoes the progress made toward the Entente Cordiale and stops Franco-British rapprochement dead in its tracks. The French had nothing to offer Britain that Germany could not match, and so feeling far less secure now that their fears had been manifested into reality, France would seek additional allies elsewhere, for so long as they stood so significantly outmatched by the Quadruple Alliance, Franco-Russian geopolitical aims would be paralyzed. Ironically, one of the most receptive potential allies France would find would be neighboring Italy, who, although a member of the Quadruple Alliance, desired most intensely certain lands that were held by Austria. While the alliance with Britain gave Germany and Austria the freedom to pursue their territorial ambitions, it did relatively little for Italy, who remained largely on good terms with France despite disputes over Tunisia. Even as far as North Africa went, Germany's emerging relationship with the Ottoman Empire as well as Britain's holdings in Egypt and desire to preserve Ottoman control in the region as a check against Russia would prove more frustrating for Italy than France's North African holdings. Thus, building off the 1892 Treaty of Nice, Italy and France would forge a secret alliance along with Russia, specifically targeted at Austria. Despite this, and just as in our timeline, Austria would suspect betrayal on the part of Italy and begin fortifying its border while Italy did the same. Austria's Italian uprising of 1902 may provide a spark that ignites war between the Franco-Russian-Italian Entente and the Triple Alliance of Austria, Germany, and Britain. However, a more likely culprit would be the Italo-Turkish War and subsequent First Balkan War, which saw the Ottomans and Austrians collaborate against the emerging Balkan states, who were backed by Russia and Italy. In such a circumstance, we might expect Greece to align itself with the Triple Alliance instead of the Balkan League, given Britain's historic support for Greek independence and the threat Italy would pose to Greek autonomy, as well as the promise of lands then in dispute with Bulgaria. The Greeks, not being Slavs, held fewer loyalties to Russia than might the Serbs or Bulgarians, and were in a strategically valuable position to assist the Ottomans via the Aegean Sea. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before the outbreak of this alternate Great War, quite a few things would occur. France, still seeking allies, would attempt to revive the Franco-Ottoman alliance, but such a thing would conflict with Russia's ambitions, Ottoman desires for neutrality to restabilize itself, and German desires to court the Ottomans as a proxy state. France could attempt to forge an alliance with Japan, but Britain had already been courting the Japanese. The French held a significant East Asian coastal possession in the form of Indochina, which the Japanese may soon desire, and that's not even mentioning the fact that competing Russo-Japanese ambitions appeared ready to spark a war. The US is out of the question given its budding relationship with Britain and its historic neutrality. Even China is out of the question given its increasing instability and the fact that both France and Russia have ambitions for Chinese territory. Only Bulgaria and Romania seem like reasonable additions, the Romanians being promised Austro-Hungarian lands for their involvement and Bulgaria being promised Balkan lands from Turkey and Greece. Spain, who had remained neutral in our timeline, could be persuaded to participate if promised colonial concessions from a defeated Britain, the Spaniards hoping to regain their prestige after having lost their colonial holdings to the US in the Spanish-American War. Though that being said, its contributions would be terribly limited, and it's questionable if even Spain felt it was capable of contributing to the war at all, so they're likely off the table. In 1902, Britain, having been courting Japan as an ally to further check Russia in the Far East, would propose their entry into the Triple Alliance. Seeing benefits to having Germany and Austria as checks against Russia in the West that would force us to fight on two fronts, not to mention the opportunity to seize French Indochina on account of the Franco-Russian alliance, Japan would ultimately accept, though find itself at odds with perceived Anglo-German ambitions on China. As the Russo-Japanese War broke out following rising Russian-Japanese tension over colonial claims, so would some fear the outbreak of a greater conflict, but because of Japan having been the power to initiate hostilities, the alliance would not activate in this circumstance. Likewise, France, fearing the activation of the Triple Alliance, would, just as in our timeline, fail to support its ally of Russia, further revealing the weakness of France and Russia's position on the global stage. No matter how you slice it, the simple reality for France and Russia is that this would become their era of ultimate decline on the global scene. There was little that they could do to challenge the Anglo-German Alliance, as virtually all their geopolitical actions could be effectively countered and reversed, or simply deterred from ever happening. Optimistically, we might imagine France and Russia using this opportunity to turn inward and focus on strengthening their militaries and domestic faculties, rather than attempting to seize more externally, but Russia already appears to be on a rough trajectory, though France may rebound later down the line. The issue now is Italy, who continues to be on a belligerent path against Austria and the Ottomans in the pursuit of its own imperial sphere. Before Archduke Franz Ferdinand is even assassinated, the powers of the Triple Alliance and Entente would find themselves dragged into a major conflict fueled by Austro-German confidence in their alliance with Britain, and increased Italian hostility in response to Anglo-German interventions to support and stabilize the Ottoman Empire. Just as the transition of the Italo-Turkish War to the Balkan War drew in Austrian support, so too in this timeline would Austria lend aid to the Ottomans and in response, see retaliation by Italy, pulling both alliances into the conflict, which, though brutal, would pale in comparison to the Great War of our timeline. With the odds stacked so heavily against the Entente, a swifter end to the conflict is drawn without the grueling years of stalemate seen in our world. Neither Austria, Russia, or the Ottoman Empire collapses, as none are made to endure exhausting Great War conditions for several years. The Balkans are redrawn as per the desires of the Central Powers, leading to the creation of a Greater Greece while reducing Serbia and Bulgaria to fragments of their former selves, the Serbs being placed within the Austrian sphere of influence and the Bulgars under the Greek sphere of influence. The Ottomans would be denied any new territories in Europe given their inability to hold on to remnant lands during the conflict, but would be compensated Russian lands in the Caucasus. Germany would push for the establishment of Polish and Ukrainian buffer states between itself and Russia, made entirely from Russian imperial lands, as well as a North Caucasian republic as a buffer between the Ottoman Empire and Russia. Austria is given the time and power within the Balkans necessary to reorganize itself in response to increasing demands for Slavic representation within the empire, especially now with the annexation of Bosnia and portions of Serbia. Despite calls of resistance from Hungary, who recognized that this would reduce their influence on imperial politics, not to mention cost them a portion of their land within the empire, a third crown is established within the empire for Croatia, and by sidelining the traditionally isolationist Hungarians, Austria, along with the coastal Croats, are able to steer the empire back into an active role in Europe and at sea, revitalizing the previously stagnant empire. Italy would lose northeastern and alpine lands to Austria and its recent acquisitions in North Africa and the Aegean Sea to Greece, as well as its colonial holdings in the Horn of Africa to Britain. France, who would have put up the most significant fight and emerged the strongest of its allies, would retain its domestic borders but lose significant colonial territory to Germany, Japan, and Britain. The Germans claiming Madagascar and Equatorial Africa, the Japanese claiming Indochina, and the British claiming remaining colonies in the Horn of Africa and the western coast. Chamberlain, immediately following his success in forging the Anglo-German Alliance, would have dedicated every year leading up to the Great War to reforming the empire into an imperial federation. The ideal had gained some popularity in Britain as an alternative to traditional imperial rule. If in fact the settler colonies were moving in their own directions that the British crown could no longer account for, then better that they be given a voice at the table than forced to go out on their own. In our world, Chamberlain found repeated difficulty to push this agenda through, and the outbreak of the Great War ultimately put an end to the plan as the colonies grew ever more independent and more disillusioned with fighting Britain's wars. While it would take time, without the excruciating grind of the Great War we saw in our timeline to interfere with the empire's attempts at reform, it is likely to find a new alternative that allows it to retain the might of its various realms combined. Germany, seeking to achieve their envisioned Great Middle Africa colony, would see to conquering the Belgian Congo shortly after the Great War. Hoping to unite the remaining colony of Southwest Africa with the rest of Middle Africa, Germany would negotiate with Britain to arrange a purchase or exchange with Portugal for their colony of Angola, with Britain accepting to do so only in exchange for free movement of British citizens and commerce through German East Africa, a colony that stood in the way of Britain's desired Cape to Cairo road and railway, something Germany would be happy to oblige. Unlike in our timeline, Britain is eventually able to complete its Pan-African road and railway, allowing it to further enrich and develop its colonies on the continent, which goes on to retain until the present day. Germany is able to achieve its desired degree of self-sufficiency in global economic and military prominence, establishing a significant colonial hold within fractured China alongside Britain and Japan following the collapse of the Qing dynasty. A world in which Britain joined the Central Powers would see a continuation of the British-dominated global order, with Germany as an emerging junior partner. The unexpected alliance of Britain with its old rivals of France and Russia truly did a lot to halt the emerging power of Germany, who truly was pulling the weight of the collapsing Austrian and Ottoman empires in the Central Power alliance of our timeline. These were states that Germany wanted to preserve, but they weren't equal powers that could match Germany, Britain, or France. Britain and Germany could truly stand as an unstoppable force on the global scene and monopolize geopolitics as two halves of a whole superpower. It's unclear how long this alliance would last, as rivalry between the two appears inevitable as the global holds consolidate and begin to clash with one another, though that being said, Britain would likely still retain the advantage, given it being further along the imperial process. By the time Germany establishes significant settler colonies and begins facing imperial division, Britain's imperial federation would be better organized and capable of launching joint offensives against a rival German empire. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.